to the war in Ukraine. The country is regaining its strength against Russia. Ukraine's military has reclaimed more than 1,000 square kilometres of territory in the south and east. Let's get more on this now with our correspondent, Julia Chapman. Thank you so much for your time, Julia. Let's just speak about the current state in Ukraine and how certain settlements have been reclaimed.
That's right. Yesterday, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, announced in his nightly address that some 1,000 square kilometres had been retaken from Russian forces, including 30 settlements. Now, the Institute for the Study of War says that is, in fact, probably an underestimate, and they believe that around 2,500 square kilometres is now back in Ukrainian hands. The governor of the Kharkiv region says that the Ukrainian flag is once again flying in the town of Balaklia, a strategic town on its way to Izium, which is understood to possibly be coming into Ukrainian hands today. There has been intense fighting around there, but we are getting some initial reports that that is now in Ukrainian hands. And if that is confirmed, then that would be a very big victory for the Ukrainians. It's a logistical hub that has allowed the Russians to resupply their forces from the east. So it would be a very big loss for Russia, which has been reinforcing its positions in the east as it was stretched a bit thin, having responded to Ukraine's counteroffensive in the south. Military analysts say it was somewhat taken by surprise by the counteroffensive that was going on in the east over in recent days. So the Ukrainians have taken advantage of that element of surprise and made pretty significant gains, their biggest ones since the early days of the invasion on February 24th. This is a significant moment for the Ukrainian government, for the Ukrainian armed forces. But in retaliation, Russia has been carrying out airstrikes on a number of areas in the Kharkiv region, including the city of Kharkiv itself, Ukraine's second largest city. And the governor says overnight 1 person was killed and 20 injured in those attacks.
I think that's great progress and victories that definitely need to be celebrated. But I want us to speak about how the police are moving back in certain villages in Ukraine. But also, sadly and unfortunately, there have been signs of torture when it comes to certain bodies that have been found. Tell us more on that.
That's right. When the Russians retreated from areas around Kiev, there were widespread reports of people who had been killed at the hands of Russian soldiers who had occupied those areas near the city. Now that they are retreating from areas in the Kharkiv region, there are signs that that is the case there as well. Police are moving back into the towns and villages that the Russians have retreated from, where the Ukrainians are in control once again. And in one village, they have been shown 2 bodies that appear to have signs of torture. That is certainly of concern, and they are worried that they may find more. They have told the local population that they are not yet completely out of danger. They are expecting reprisal attacks in the area from the Russian forces. But at the moment, it is the Ukrainians that have the momentum and the upper hand, and we'll wait to see whether they can carry that on in the days and weeks to come.
Just lastly, Julia, I want to ask you about the electricity crisis and power issues there, because we know that there have been issues around destroying of where the main electricity production happens. And this is, of course, going to have a direct impact on the rest of Europe. And I think this is why Europe is in great panic at the moment, because they just don't know what's going to happen moving forward. But maybe just tell us about the electricity in the Ukraine and what's currently happening. Is that under attack?
Yes, certainly. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the south of Ukraine is in Russian hands. There has been intense fighting around that, something of great concern to nuclear safety experts. The International Atomic Energy Agency had a team of inspectors visit the power plant about 10 days ago. They came back with very worrying reports of what was seen there. Now we understand that the power plant has been completely disconnected from Ukraine's power network. It was sustaining itself, or is sustaining itself at the moment, but there are fears that the situation could get out of control there, that it will be more and more difficult to reconnect the power plant to the Ukrainian grid, and that is of grave concern to nuclear inspectors. There are, in fact, 2 UN inspectors still on site trying to get the situation under control, but it is looking increasingly precarious. The entire town, where Ukrainian staff are still living as they work to keep the power plant going, there's a blackout there. They don't have energy at the moment. So the power plant isn't just not producing energy for the rest of Ukraine, but not even for the town in which it sits. And there are fears that if it isn't connected to the power grid soon, then there is a risk of a nuclear meltdown at the power plant itself. But one expert that we spoke to yesterday says she believes that the Russians are trying to connect the plant to their own power lines in Russian-annexed Crimea, in the south of Ukraine, and more widely into Russia. So certainly very precarious situation at the moment, and one that Ukrainians are watching very closely.
Very worrying indeed. Julia, I know I said last question, but this is going to be my last question to you. I'm really curious to know what the state of Ukraine is at the moment. Previously, in the last 6 months or so, we've been seeing really devastating images coming out of Ukraine. But where you are now, are people trying to rebuild? Are people trying to get back into Ukraine? What is the current status there?
Well, in Kyiv, the situation is more or less normal. There are very few signs that anything is amiss. There are occasional air raid sirens, but for the most part, Ukrainians living in the capital don't respond to them. They don't go down into shelters like they did in the early days of the war. This is an area that was attacked by Russia at the beginning of its invasion. No longer the target because Russia, it seems, has realized it cannot take control of Kyiv or its surrounding regions. They retreated from those areas where they did have control for about a month or so at the beginning of this conflict this year. But certainly here things feel very normal. In western Ukraine, the situation is very safe. But there are still many areas of the country that are suffering with intense airstrikes and shelling in a very difficult situation. They don't know whether they will be safe in the weeks to come. There are many of them trying to evacuate still. So although the situation is precarious there, it does seem to be very stable here. So this really is a very divided country, but certainly everyone here very much supporting those coming from the east who are in those difficult situations.